Despite looking like this, I have like a little mouse voice, so this is definitely a needed device. Hello. I feel like I should copy Miss Janelle and do the clap clap, can you hear me, to pull everyone in here. But hello, good afternoon, brothers, sisters, and siblings. I'm very happy to be here. I've had a great time getting to know some of you guys already. I'm excited to make more connections after this. I'm going to show a little extra love to all the speakers that have spoke today and yesterday. Just give them a little, come on. Everyone's doing great. And, I'm not an academic myself. I deeply respect and fear all of you very much. So being able to learn from people like you guys is a huge honor. It's always just a treat. And I'm in so much awe of the work that academics do to preserve and document and archive the history that journalists like me get to benefit from when we swoop in afterwards and try and tell people all about the cool stuff you've done. And I'm also so grateful to all the organizers for all the vital work that they've been doing. I know it can be hard and draining and sometimes boring and sometimes infuriating, but without them, without you and the workers that you're organizing alongside, none of the rest of it matters. So thank you for that. So having to follow all of that is a little nerve-wracking, but I'm going to do my best. Bear with me. And I realize some of you also might be wondering, who is this weird-looking tattooed lady who has been wandering around showing up to things late all weekend? So I will introduce myself a little more thoroughly. Hi, my name's Kim. I'm a labor journalist. I'm an author. I was a 3-time council person for the Writers Guild of America East. I just finished up my 6th year on that council, and I am done with that. And that is... It was really interesting to see how the sausage was made, but it was enough to almost turn me vegan. I think I do a little better in the rank and file, but all learning experiences are valuable learning experiences. Some of you might have read my book, My Giant Goth Child, that is up there, or seen my work in other publications like In These Times or Teen Vogue or The Baffler, or basically anybody I can trick into letting me write for them. Or you might have seen me on Twitter, in which case I am sorry. So, but here's the most important thing. I'm a 3rd-generation union member, and that's something I'm very, very proud of. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are able to say that in this country. It's a damn shame. I grew up in a blue-collar union household in rural South Jersey, in the Pine Barrens, which, yes, I know the Sopranos thing, but the Jersey Devil is much cooler as a reference, just so everyone knows. My dad and uncles and granddad were all operating engineers. My grandma was a teacher, and my other grandma delivered newspapers, and my mom was a cafeteria worker at my high school. She was way cooler than me, like obviously. I was in my black lipstick phase at the time. But my grandma and my mom, they didn't have those union protections, and they worked those low-wage, difficult part-time jobs to help keep our family afloat. And growing up, the union was always in the background. It wasn't something I really thought about unless my dad was going on strike or going to protest Scott Walker at the Capitol in Trenton or complaining about our extra boring meeting. It was just there. I knew that the grass was green, the sky was blue, and the union had our back. And it wasn't really until I was a teenager, about 17, and my mom collapsed at work one day, that I really came to understand the importance and the difference that a union can have to a working-class family like ours. She had a brain aneurysm at work, and she spent about a year in the hospital. And by the time she came home, her bills were up to about $250,000. Without my dad's union health insurance, that would have been it for us. We would have been ruined. So the union saved us, and it saved my mom. And that's why she's still around. And years later, and that had a big impact, I was just becoming sort of a person, like an adult, and seeing how close our family came to just being absolutely destroyed financially when we weren't doing that great in the beginning. And to start with, I was like, okay, this union thing, I'm going to put that in my back pocket for now and just, think that, okay, they're cool. But it wasn't until years later when I was working at this media company called Vice in New York City, and my coworkers asked me how I felt about starting a union, that I got to pull that thought back out of my pocket and hold it close and go, oh my God, thank God it's my turn. And I jumped at the chance to get involved. I was in every meeting and every bargaining session, every committee. They call me the pit bull because, there's always someone who has to play that role when you're talking to bosses that don't understand you or value you and make more money than God. And it turns out I was a natural. We ended up joining the Writers Guild of America East, and which now, that was such a wild time. I was talking to some folks about this yesterday, about media unions and the way that public interest in literacy in unions has gone up precipitously in the past few years. And I'm pretty sure one of the reasons, at least, is because in 2015 and 2016 and onwards, there was such a big wave of organizing in that sector. There was Gawker, there was Vice, and Slate, and Vox, and so many other digital media shops unionized with the Writers Guild and with the News Guild. And the way that impacted things was, just think about taking a dandelion seed, right, and going like this, and seeing all those seeds go all over the place. Every big media layoff was another dandelion seed exploding and sending workers who had bargain contracts and knew union lawyers and cared about working class consciousness and got it, were being sent out to new publications to cause trouble there, or to go freelance like some of us and write more about labor. It really did matter, and it's really an honor to have been a part of it. I never thought I would get to join a union because all I ever wanted to do was write about music. And I didn't really think there was going to be a local 666 knocking on my door trying to get me to join up. But it turns out there kind of was. And the union we built changed everything for me. And it set me on the path of labor, which has been the most rewarding thing I think I could have done with my life. Just this week, news broke that Vice, after several torturous years, couple decades of bad management and greedy bosses and just the general vagaries of existing in digital media, that they were going to stop publishing. So I was going back through all my archives. And I made it back to 2016, and I saw the first ever labor article I wrote. And it was about Guitar Center union busting back in 2016. And I knew that was the moment where I was trying to figure out how I could write about this labor stuff while it was still my day job to write about, Icelandic black metal and interview guys named Corpse Grinder. And eventually that decision was made for me when I got laid off in 2019. And I decided I was going to be a labor reporter. But in that moment when I started writing those stories, I didn't think any publications would take me seriously because I didn't have a degree in labor studies. I didn't have any of the credentials that I thought you had to have to be involved in labor, to speak on labor, to learn about labor, and write about labor. But my experience organizing and getting to know people and getting to know the movement from the inside, of joining it as a worker, I realized that credentials are nice, but experience is really what matters. I came to the movement that most people do, as a worker who was fed up with her shitty workplace, who wanted to make it better. And it's hard to describe how transformative a union can be unless you've experienced it yourself. So I'm just thankful I got to have that experience before I decided to run away and be a full-time labor reporter, which is sort of a job. We're trying. There's about 7 of us out there. But it's getting better. And at this point, even being a union member in this country is rare. We've seen the numbers. We hate the numbers. I'm not a numbers guy. We're not going to talk about the numbers. We're going to operate more on vibes here. And it almost feels like a privilege in a way to have those benefits, to have that idea of someone having your back, to have that solidarity and that sisterhood, brotherhood, siblinghood with other people in your industry, in your line of work. It may feel like a privilege, but we all know that it's actually a right. It's still nowhere as easy to join a union as it should be, but that hasn't stopped folks from trying, or from organizing outside of that system if it doesn't work for them, or if it hasn't been welcoming enough to them. It's a really exciting moment for labor right now, which obviously we all know and are part of and are studying and are doing. And we're looking at these big organizing wins and strikes and worker victories, and it feels like everywhere we turn, people are talking about unions in a way that is excited and energetic and hopeful. And a lot of those people are younger people too, which is something I think is very important. I mean, if you think about it, so many of the people we see in black and white photos leading marches and holding strikes and raising hell, they weren't that old. Most of the civil rights leaders that changed the world were in their 30s and 20s. Younger people are to be listened to and respected and pulled in, not cast aside just because, you think you know more than they do. They're going to think they know more than the next generation too, but that's the next generation's problem. And that influx in new faces and ideas and perspectives that we've been seeing in so many industries, both established union strongholds and brand new organizing targets, has powered a necessary shift in the way that the public views unions and the way that unions view themselves too. Reform movements and historic heavy hitters like the Teamsters and especially the UAW have introduced millions of union members to the benefits of direct democracy. And no, I know that there are more reform caucuses bubbling away in a few other big unions too, which I'm very excited to keep an eye on. And there have been a number of exciting developments as a result of that organizing. The grassroots organizing that led to the one member, one vote win, that led to the Teamsters for Democratic Union having that victory. But one thing I'm really excited about seeing along with that new wave is a more open and explicit kind of solidarity with vulnerable workers and a willingness to publicly take more progressive, even radical political positions. Now, of course, many unions have already been doing this for decades, if not centuries. I got a shout out to the IWW, who were founded as a multiracial, multigender, anti-capitalist union in 1905 and are still doing great work around the country, including in Phoenix. Statements are nice, but action is always better. And while there's still so much more that could be done, it really does matter that we're seeing unions like the UAW calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and announcing a new solidarity initiative with auto workers in Mexico, that RWDSU signed on to a class action lawsuit against the state of Alabama for its horrific prison slavery system, that Cecil Roberts from the United Mine Workers sent a message of support to striking strippers in Hollywood, and that the AFA's Sarah Nelson takes every opportunity she can to speak up for bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. And I was thinking about all this yesterday during our pilgrimage to the Twin Flames exhibit when Ms. Janelle was speaking to her group about solidarity and the different ways that people have shown up for one another in the midst of unspeakable violence and repression. That's the word, right? Solidarity. It's the heart of everything we do and that we're trying to do. One of our movement's favorite rallying cries, which, again, shout out to the Wobblies, is an injury to one is an injury to all. It's a beautiful sentiment, but I don't think labor has always done its best to uphold it. Actually, I know it hasn't because I've read a lot of labor history books. And it was impossible to look at that exhibit of sacred objects and not think about the fact that so many police, including the worst of those bad apples, the abusers and the murderers, are in unions, and many are under the umbrella of the AFL-CIO. So are many prison guards, border guards, and ICE agents, people whose function is to oppress, to imprison, to brutalize and control the poor and working class. I've written extensively about this, so I'll spare you the diatribe, but I'll just say that there's a reason that my union, the Writers Guild of America East, passed a resolution calling on the AFL-CIO to disaffiliate from cop unions during my time on council. But meanwhile, there are millions of workers who want to be represented by unions, who want and need and deserve the benefits that a union brings, but aren't able to do so because of our rickety labor laws that intentionally exclude domestic workers, agricultural workers, and increasingly children, because employers can still intimidate, threaten, and union bust with impunity because the NLRB and OSHA are underfunded, overwhelmed, and the financial penalties that they can levy are changed to billion-dollar corporations because of rampant worker misclassification that denies workers protections and the ability to unionize, because the work of parenting, housework, and reproductive labor aren't recognized as the jobs they are, because of the criminalization of the occupations or of some workers' occupations or of their very presence in this country, and because of the 1977 Jones versus North Carolina Prisoners' Labor Union decision that stripped incarcerated workers of their right to organize, clearing the path for continued forced labor and legalized slavery. Too many people have been left out. And that's why when I got the chance to write a book back in 2020, I think I started writing it. Time is a flat circle at this point. I started writing it in the very beginning of the pandemic, when I had all these plans. I was going to go to this center and this research archive and talk to these people and this people. I didn't go anywhere. I stayed in South Philly, made a lot of phone calls, spent a lot of time on JSTOR, made a lot of panic texts to my friends in academia that had access to the good JSTOR. And because without that .edu, you're not getting too far. And I bought a lot of books. And in this book, I focused on women, Black and brown and indigenous and Latino and Asian and Pacific Islander workers, immigrant workers, queer and trans workers, disabled workers, and workers whose labor has been criminalized, like sex workers and undocumented workers, and incarcerated workers. And the goal is to show how the labor movement has intersected with every other movement for justice, and to challenge stereotypical ideas about the working class and labor in this country, and who unions are for. You know, it's not enough to bargain for bread and butter economic issues. Unions and their leaders need to recognize the full humanity of their members, and understand that for many workers, a union contract is the only legal document they can trust to protect at least some of their rights. You know, I really appreciated Professor Johnny's comments earlier about the idea of building working class consciousness outside of these kind of traditional areas, outside of traditional unions that haven't been serving the needs of the workers that have been neglected or boxed out. I think that's a really important thought to hold on to, because even with our robust historical union structures, they're still not there for everybody. And so the people that are left out have done their own kinds of organizing, whether it's dancers in Portland or the incarcerated workers in Alabama who are right now trying to launch a prison strike. Sorry. I work from home, so I don't talk this much usually. But the image of the burly white guy in a hard hat has dominated the mainstream narrative for a very long time. And of course, those folks make up an important part of labor history too. Like, they raised me. That's my dad, that's my uncles, that's my granddad. But the rest of us have always been here too. And in many cases have had to fight the hardest against the toughest odds to force change. From the mill girls of Lowell and the washerwomen of Jackson, from the multiracial coal miners of Appalachia and the queer steel workers in the Midwest, from Nagi Daifula and Larry Itliong to Emma Tanayuka and Maria Key, from Dorothy Bolden and Baird Rustin to Michelle Nieves and Jennifer Bates, from the North Carolina Prisoners' Labor Union to Strippers United. These are the people I've always been most interested in writing about and learning about and sharing the stories of. Because labor history should be inclusive and diverse and accessible and messy and human, because it's our stories. Every movement needs its heroes and its martyrs, but regular working people have changed the world too. And I think they deserve just as much shine as the people that get streets and statues named for them. You know, I believe it was Big Bill Haywood. I mean, we're in the Southwest. This is the stomping grounds. I feel like his presence is around here somewhere, eyeballing us. But I believe it was Big Bill Haywood who once said, if the workers are organized, all they have to do is put their hands in their pockets, and they've got the capitalist class whipped. And we've seen that happen time and time again throughout history. From back home in Philly, where we played host to the nation's first ever general strike in 1935, not to brag, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Great Textile Strike of 1934, the Piston Coal Strike of 1989, and so many others. As we all know, strikes are just one of the tools in the working class toolbox, but they can be awfully effective when wielded wisely. And as history has shown us over and over and over again, Strikes are at their strongest when they're built on multiracial, multigender, multilingual, multi-everything coalitions of workers who know that giving in to artificial divisions is just doing the boss's work for him. And they know how powerful we are when we stand together. That's a message I really tried to hammer home in this book. And kind of in general, that's like my vibe. But that's a message I really tried to hammer home when I was writing about people like Ben Fletcher, a black socialist dock worker who helped organize an interracial militant union on the South Philly docks for over a decade in 1910, or the Great Sugar Strike of 1948, which saw immigrant sugarcane field workers from China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and all over the place join native Hawaiian workers to take on the big five sugar bosses, like the Jeff Bezos of dental decay, and win. You know there's a dentist convention at the hotel a lot of us are staying at? But it's how the Amazon Labor Union won in Staten Island, and it's how the workers in the campaigns that you're leading and working on are going to win too. You know, the world is changing at a rapid pace, and so is our movement. There are a lot of ways to draw a paycheck, and many of them would have never even occurred to our predecessors. I mean, try explaining Uber to Eugene Debs, or walking Walter Reuther through the whole AI situation. Like, I don't even really know how it works, and I'm alive now. It's a different world in a lot of ways, but many of the challenges that our forebears faced are the same. One thing we must always remember about our movement is that there's no one answer to every problem. Every worker is unique, and every problem is multifaceted. To some people, the early days of labor may seem like a dusty historical throwback in comparison to this exciting new wave of organizing that we're seeing all over the place. But we do always need to remember that those workers were fighting for the same things we are now. A decent wage, a safe workplace, stability, and a little bit of dignity. One of the things that appeals to me so greatly about labor history, and what made me write like a 400-page book about it, is that sense of movement. The feeling that one gets from looking back and seeing how far we've come, and finding inspiration to push us further in the direction we know we need to go. There are a few major themes in my book, and I will quit with the sales pitch. You can all see the QR code. But I was going to bring some, but they're heavy. But I do want to emphasize one that's pretty simple, and I hope comes across in both the book and just all of my reporting and conversations with folks in the movement. And that's hope. Throughout the history of working people in this country, hope has been manifested in endless ways. For many, it's been holding tight to the certainty that things will get better as long as we continue to fight. It's keeping the faith, refusing to be intimidated or bullied, and not letting the bastards get us down. Every person I write about in Fight Like Hell and cover in my work as a labor journalist has understood the power of hope. That's one of the few things the boss can never take from us, and something we hold so much power to build up ourselves. The world can be so very dark, and we're living through a particularly cruel moment where so many of us are seeing our rights and our liberties challenged or stripped away entirely. But as history has shown us time and time again, those rights were not granted to us by benevolent rulers. We organized and fought and struggled and failed and tried again until finally we took them. We're all facing an uncertain future right now, and the democracy, or what passes for it in this country, hangs in the balance. But one thing I do know for sure, as we move forward into new ways of living, working, and consuming, is that the workers whose blood, sweat, and tears got us here cannot be forgotten, tossed aside, or left out of the conversation. One thing we should all be able to agree on and prioritize is every worker's right to a good wage, health care, dignity, and respect on the job. It can be far too easy for people to forget about the folks whose labor quite literally keeps the lights on. Ultimately, what's important to remember too, I know I'm asking you to remember a lot, but I have faith in you, is that we're all on the same side. It's us, the workers, against the bad bosses, greedy CEOs and feckless politicians who try to keep a boot on our necks and their hands in our wallets just like it's always been. And I also want you to remember that there is still so many more of us than there are of them. And together, you are so much more powerful than you can even imagine. And in closing, I want to leave you with a few words to chew on. I'm not a teacher, but there's homework. As you all know very well, the work is never done, but victory is always possible. We have triumphed before, and we'll do it again. We've lost a lot of battles too, but even those losses have left important lessons for the generations of workers that came after. And we have to continue building on the legacies of those who came before. I believe that the cause of labor is the hope of the world. And if we fight like hell for it, together, that world is truly ours to win.
So that was terrific, and it gives you only a hint of what's in the book. So there's a lot more chance to enjoy this. I don't want so much to add anything as to underscore a few things, but I'm going to do that in a way that each of which is a question. So maybe you can say a little more in relation, just a handful of them. But before that, let me say, Kim set this up by saying correctly that she recognized that being able to have voice wasn't all about credentials. She cites experience. She brought experience to it. Let me add, she brought empathetic interviewing skills. I mean, over and over in the book and in some of her other writings, she's talking to people and gaining their experience, their understanding, their perspective to add to her own. So it'd be misleading if you thought this was just her story of her experience, because it's a remarkable skill. And it's not a mile apart from a skill of a good organizer, too, to be able to actually understand how people see the world, what's important to them, what's going on that's troubling, and how their lives can get better. So it's an empathetic interviewing. It's also reading and research, right? She's not trying to be a labor studies professor, but she's doing her homework. And she's trying to learn, whether it's a historical case in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, or it's a more recent history that's coming out of the civil rights movement, or something else. She's taking advantage of whatever resources there are available to understand better, which is good advice to all of us. You shouldn't leave that reading and research to the people with credentials in the labor studies departments or the sociology departments or somewhere else. That's an available tool for all of us. Lastly, the one that's going to be hardest for most of us to emulate, is a damn good writer. Just the quality of the writing. It is lively, it is engaging, it drives you forward, you want to keep reading. So this is what Kim brings to telling labor's stories. And I'll emphasize stories because it's very plural. She tells you right away in the book she's not telling the history, right? I'm going to guess she thinks Philip Foner's a great man, and she's not trying to compete with what he did, right, in giving a comprehensive, integrative history. She's telling plural stories and histories of the labor movements, which are themselves plural. Now, some questions for you in this. So first thing to underscore is the importance of journalism, right? And yeah, well, this is the age we live in. These things happen. The journalism itself is an important part of the story, and there are several ways in which this comes out. I'd love to hear you say more about being a journalist and covering labor, which seems to me, I mean, it includes a variety of things. You're famous, among other things, for shaping pathways to unionization by explaining things like what a union is, right? Or what a strike is, what the general strike call is, giving accessible introductions to people who might not otherwise be familiar, because not everyone is a third generation union family member, right? And in fact, increasingly, it's important for this to happen. So there's familiarization, that shaped pathways. Is there something to like reaching disconnected workers? I mean, right from Jerry's talk at the beginning of this, we're hearing about a shift away from very large concentrated workforces in classical manufacturing plants, right, which present one kind of arena for organizing, to a bunch of very dispersed, smaller places. It seems to me part of the role of journalism is connecting up these various dispersed sites of organizing, and when we have as low a union penetration as we have in the country, we need it all the more, because it's not going to be a part of everyone's obvious experience. And then I get the sense also that you are yourself doing, but you are also reporting on moments when journalism is countering employers' anti-union propaganda, including in real time during strikes, right? Where the organizing effort is being met by a very effective, often, counter effort to shape how people think, what are the consequences, what's going to go on. It's sometimes journalists who are providing the most effective rebuttal. So am I getting that right? And what do you see as the roles of the journalist in the labor movement for the labor movement?
I like to check. Okay. I like to think of myself as like a human microphone stand, because whoever I'm speaking to at any given time, especially if it's a worker, like whatever they have to say is far more important than anything I think. So I want them to talk to me as much as they will. I want to share as much of their story as they're comfortable. And getting them to that point, like, that takes a little finesse. It takes listening. It takes being respectful, of knowing how to act, of knowing, being tuned into different types of socialization, I guess. Like, I absolutely am going to address older folks as sir and ma'am when I'm in the South. I'm absolutely going to try and cover up some of my tattoos if I'm talking to more conservative type people. Like, you kind of just have to read the room, because you're just talking to people, right? Like, if you know how to interact with people, you can bring that into it. But I have found with some reporters, not even just labor reporters, I think some of it does have to do with your own socialization and your background. Like, because I'm from a very working class place, and I feel most comfortable around coal miners and steel workers and people that work with their hands, like my family always did. I am totally fine talking to those types of workers. Honestly, I'm more scared of academic and graduate workers, because y'all are so smart. And you probably know and have so much, and things are so complicated. But you have to bring your own humanity to the process, right? And also know who's the expert, who's not. Know your limitations, which is why I'm so grateful to all the brilliant academics who are in labor studies programs that I can call and be like, yo, can you explain this? Like, this is too many acronyms for me even. Or can you give me some context? Like, I have so much value and appreciation for those folks. But you do have to kind of, not everyone approaches things the same way I do, and that's fine. It's diversity of tactics. But some folks work for publications that are much stricter about objectivity, this idea of bias and all of this. And I don't care, because I know what side I'm on, and I'm freelance, and I tend to write for publications that are cool with that. I'm not going to write for the New York Times anytime soon, but I get to write for a lot of really smart, more progressive or lefty, or even just culture publications that are willing to let me write with my own perspectives. I think that adds a little something to it. And just centering workers' voices above everything else. Like, I don't need a quote from the boss. I know what they're going to say. That's not interesting. That doesn't add anything.
And by the way, some other people are covering them.
Yeah, here's the thing, right? Like, since I'm freelance and I've carved out this funny little space for myself, I can get away with things that other journalists maybe can't necessarily do, or don't feel like they have the space to do. So I want to exploit that as much as I can. And I mean, I've seen what happens when bosses, you're talking about during strikes, when the need for real accurate information in a real-time sense is so important. I remember being down in Alabama covering this coal miners' strike and seeing and discovering that the coal company where I met had hired this like boutique LA PR firm to plant stories in the local media and turn the tide of public opinion against the miners. And at that point, I was like the only person covering their side of the story. So I was like, well, I guess I'm going back. I'm going to call it The Nation. They'll let me write something. Call it in these times. They'll let me write something. It's kind of, I think you kind of have to allow yourself to see it as a us and them. You kind of have to pick sides. And there are obviously labor journalists who are very effective at what they do who don't approach things that way. That's fine, but that's not what I'm interested in doing. I mean, back in the day, you had people like Mary Heaton Vorse working campaigns for, not the mine workers, I can't remember, maybe it was CWA, working campaigns for unions while also going down to cover the mine wars and cover the mill girls. Like, I think it's okay to not pretend that you haven't picked a side, because this is labor. It's labor versus capital. It's good versus evil. I think it's okay to say I'm rooting for the good guys, even if that's not going to get me a job at the Washington Post anytime soon.
Well, so I completely agree, except I want to quibble with you're conceding a lot to the people who equate objectivity with, quote, both sides of the story and equally covered, and not questioning the original assumptions. So I'm not going to buy that that's objective. Sometimes objectivity is telling the truth about a struggle in which there aren't two equal stories on different sides.
That's a good perspective. Yeah, because usually when you hear objectivity, it's like, what do, no offense, but like the rich white guys in charge think about this?
Well, exactly.
But if it's a term, if we take objectivity to mean just the truth, the bare facts of the matter, then of course the workers are the good guys against in almost every single situation you can think of in terms of labor conflict.
And they are sometimes the heroes, sometimes simply victims. There are a lot of different things, right? So the objectivity around the Triangle Shirtwaist fire is not, don't worry, I went and interviewed the owners and I got their perspective on how happy they were that the court threw out the case.
Right.
That,
they made money off of it.
Right. I mean, so I just want to claim more of you for the truth, which is central to objectivity.
Oh, I like that. It's very philosophical.
So let me go on. You said in your talk here and in the book that you were thinking intersectionally. I mean, this is a term that is constantly repeated and usually trivialized, unfortunately, in a lot of academic conversations. But I want to try to bring out one of the nice things about the way you write about workers is they're never just workers. And you don't perpetuate an illusion that being a worker means not being religious or a Chicana or black or queer or, that all of the characters, I think, are workers and have other identities or embedded in other communities. And sometimes the success of their struggles depends a lot on that, right? So a struggle of Chicano workers depends on solidarity in the Chicano community and among women, as well as a workerist solidarity. Am I getting this? Is this?
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, that's what I tried to do.
Yeah,
because
so
that's
that
if you think about it, there's such a, at least in popular history and maybe in history in general, I could say, I think there's this impulse to sort of silo out different movements. Like, here's the queer liberation bucket, here's the civil rights bucket, here's women's rights. But if you think about it, at any moment, whether it was during those civil rights marches or during the anti-war movement in the 70s, or right now when you have people marching for trans lives and black lives and for Palestine, whether it's happening on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, almost every person who is part of that protest then has to go to work on Monday. So they are workers. So their issues are labor issues because that's their issue. We're all so much, and you can't just say, okay, you're just a worker. That's one thing that kills me sometimes when I see people who are writing about workers' rights or labor stories that kind of parachute in, and I'll hear them talk to like the union comms folks, like, get me a worker. I need a worker quote. And I'm like, do you mean like Jennifer or Daryl? Like, do you care about these folks? Because if you did, you would probably have a different approach. Just be cool, man.
So these are real people. They're not just tokens of the type worker. Um, and in being real people, they have multiple sides to their lives, different connections and things like that. So I have a sense that one of the things that we want to bring out is the importance, I mean, simply just the importance, the humanity of that, but also the importance for the labor movement of being a connector among these things, right? So that these various other communities potentially get connected by unions and by organizing struggles.
Yeah, I think, and I think I'm right in that when you think about it, labor and the workplace, that is one of the only instances in our culture, in our society, where you are going to be thrown into a position with a bunch of other people that you didn't pick. You don't know anything about them. They could be from any other different background. You're nothing like them, but you have to go to work. You have to work alongside them. You have to find common ground to get along. And that's the very beginning, little baby seed of starting a union, of finding ways to care about people who are very different from you, who are going through similar problems. Like one of my favorite little historical, I guess, stories from the book goes back to the 70s, the Section 504 protests, when one of my favorite facts, that the longest peaceful federal occupation of a federal building in U.S. history was led by disabled activists in San Francisco and other cities that were trying to force the government to actually enact or enforce regulations to assist with disabled people's employment. Like in San Francisco, they held it down for 30 days, and that was a group that was led by queer women who were also disabled. They made inroads and connections with the local Black Panther Party, who showed up with food every day, because two of those people who were also disabled were Black Panthers. They were fed by church groups too, because some of those folks were religious. They were given resources and transportation by the Machinist Union, who, especially in D.C., when some of those leaders traveled out there to talk to Congress, the Machinists showed up with a box truck and some rope, because a lot of those folks use wheelchairs or other mobility aids. This was pre-ADA. And they're like, look, we're going to make it work somehow. And it did. And all of those different communities coming together to fight for the right to work in a real way, not in a, garbage right-wing propaganda way. It just shows like how much we all do have in common.
And there are some unions, the machinists back in the day, the IM, were a union that was often supportive of other unionization struggles, right? So there's a variation in the extent to which reaching beyond the current interests of current members to a wider good is there. So a lot of this story gets taken into labor context as the importance of being diverse and recognizing the diversity within unions and all that. I want to ask about another side. I mean, that's all important, which is the place of unions in the self-understanding of each of these other groups or identities or the histories being written about them. So when people say, this is the story of disabled people, this is the story of Catholics or evangelicals, this is the story of women, this is the story of the Chicano community in the U.S., do unions figure as importantly as they should in each of those other lines of history?
If they're doing a good job, they should be part of it already. But that's the big if. Not all unions have been as I mean, this is the U.S. Up until the 60s, black workers were excluded from most unions. Like, that's a huge aspect of all this. The AFL pre-CIO, they actively had no interest in organizing Latino workers in the Southwest until organizers here kind of forced them to pay attention. Like, there's a very long and ugly history of exclusion within the labor movement. So there have always been exceptions to that, whether it's the IWW, the Marine Cooks and Stewards Union, or the mine workers. But it's not the prettiest history when it comes to actually showing up for people. That's why it's been important to see when that's happened. Like, I think you would probably be unable to write a real history of like the Chicano movement in California, at least, without talking about the United Farm Workers, right? Because they understood those intersections, they understood the people, they showed up. Could you say that for every other movement for justice? The Civil Rights Movement, so many of those folks were involved in unions, A. Philip Randolph and Baird Rustin. We all know what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was doing right before he was gunned down. Like, labor has been there, but has it always showed up?
Well, and does it get the attention in the history? So just take the civil rights example. I say, so we all know this, and you said it. But I would say that the theme of the importance of unions, the importance of organizing tactics that were passed on from unions into the civil rights struggle, songs back and forth between traditions, the story of the black church as a free space is much more strongly narrated in accounts of the civil rights movement than the story of unions involved. And I'm just wondering if there are versions of that in almost all these other things. And for those of us who are academics, it is that part of the job should be not just to find the multiple diversities among workers that unions should organize, but to narrate the place that unions have had in these other fields.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. I guess that comes down to who's writing the books and writing the histories and what experience they've had with unions. If they think and understand the kind of fullness of labor history, they think, oh, unions are just this special interest thing or just economic thing or just a white guys in hard hats thing. Maybe it's...
Or tactical at the moment. Well, let's present Hispanics as all interested in starting small businesses and not unions because that will work better with certain audiences we're trying to reach or something like that. But, so, and I think what I'm hoping this illustrates is that the stories you're telling aren't just interesting stories. They are usable history, can get you thinking about a bunch of other questions that goes on. And the important, my third and last of these lines is to talk about the importance of history. I want you to talk about it a little more. Because you set out to write about labor, and you write about many things in different articles, some of them historical, some of them not. And when you set out to write this first book, you choose to do it as histories, right? So my first question is sort of, what does that mean to you? Why histories as the focus?
I really like history.
That's a good reason.
That's the simple answer, right? And not to be too I don't know anything, but I do wish that a book like this had been readily available when I was first getting involved in the union and learning about what my role could possibly be and learning that, I was allowed, that people that weren't just people like my granddad or my grandma had not only been a part of unions in my lifetime, but for centuries. I didn't know what was possible until I started reading everything I could get my hands on at the library and the bookstore and all over the place. And I'm a big nerd, so I took the time to do all that. But if I could have just picked up one book that gave me a decent foundation, that might have been helpful. And
so that's a great achievement for others who are in that situation.
I hope so, right? I wanted to make it easy because obviously there's so much brilliant and important writing about labor history that has been done by academics and on academic presses and journals. It's out there, obviously, but not everyone is going to know where to find it. And academic books are expensive, man. It kills me every time. But all that to say, I also just think it's very, I keep saying important, but it is. It's important for people to know where we came from, right? Because if you read about unions happening right now, Starbucks union, UAW, oh, cool, that's exciting. But knowing that there's a dozen years of history behind one or hundreds of years behind another, and just learning about all the people that came before and what they did to get you closer to that point, I think that kind of adds fuel to the fire. That adds some inspiration. And it also shows that people that had it even worse than you do right now stood up and did something when it felt even more impossible. So, if black women could organize in Mississippi in 1866 against employers to try and demand fair wages, you can go talk to your boss. Just seeing all these examples of bravery and struggle and ingenuity that the working class and the poor have conjured up over the centuries, I think that is valuable. And if you can give that to people, it's almost like a gift. It's
it is a gift.
You can do it too.
It is a gift. You have a gift, and you are giving a gift. And what you're doing in that is focused on what's possible. So tie it back to that conversation about objectivity. You're not telling the average story or the composite picture, if that were the one notion of objectivity. You're telling several true stories that give people ideas of what's possible despite adversity in difficult circumstances, and that sometimes takes 50 years of struggle. So there's a cautionary tale. Don't expect it all to be done next week, but it's about what's possible most of the time.
Even in the very end, I was writing this book while I was going back and forth to rural Alabama to cover a coal miners' strike, and I was really hoping it would solve itself out by the end, and I have a nice little bow to tie on the very end. And by the time I finished the manuscript, the strike was still going. I was like, oh God, okay, fine. When the paperback comes out, then it'll be done by then, and I can say, here's our happy ending, or here's our sad but inspiring ending. And it was still going on when I finished the updates for that draft. So I just had to work it in. Like, this is what history is. It's never over.
At the beginning too, but so they lose a second vote, but they lose it by a narrower margin.
Oh, these are two. There's a lot of losses,
and they go on. And right,
Alabama has a rough time.
But that's part of your story. You're giving perspective, not just on moments of victory, and not just on the heroic individual who stands up, I would say, but you're asking, what does it mean to be committed to struggle? And in it, sometimes for the long term, in various contexts, what does it take to be supported in being committed to struggle?
You have to be realistic, too. I mean, garment workers are still struggling. I remember that I think my chapter on garment workers ends speaking to a garment worker in L.A. who was working on cloth masks during the early days of the COVID pandemic, and she was telling me how there was no ventilation and the doors were locked. And that chapter started with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and there's 100 years in between those two things, so the struggle's never over.
So many of your chapters have that sort of three moments in history in this, and we need to face that. So we've got a return of child labor, we've got a return of the locked doors, we've got continuing issues with ventilation and inhalation of toxic substances, we have things, so a lot, right, continues in struggle. There's a rhythm to it, though, right, of ups and downs and sideways turns as this all moves forward. Where do you see our moment in this rhythm of the history of labor struggles in the U.S.?
I guess we're sort of in the middle of a wave, right? Like the wave's been going up, it's going up.
Wave, yeah.
I think upward, but that means it has to come down eventually, which hopefully will not be, it's 2024. Hopefully that will not come quite as soon as some of us are fearing. But right now and I know whenever, we were laughing about this last night, every time the BLS puts out new numbers, it's a bummer. Or it's like, oh, cool, we got 0.1% in the right direction. Sick. But I don't think those numbers tell the whole story. Like, I think the enthusiasm and energy we're seeing in young people organizing and people organizing outside of the NLRB and just the rise of worker centers and independent unions and minority unions and all these different, I guess, just formations of organizing we're seeing. Like, the BLS doesn't count those, but that's the kind of stuff that moves the movement forward. So many of the most impactful moments in labor history, like the NLRB didn't rubber stamp that. Sometimes it wasn't even legal to organize, but they did it anyway. Like, Philly passed a domestic workers' Bill of Rights a couple years ago. That wouldn't have happened if in the 60s Dorothy Bolden had not put together her National Domestic Workers Alliance, which wasn't an official union, but it organized thousands of black women and got huge wage increases in Atlanta in the 60s. Like that, there's a direct line there. And even if our wave is going down, or if it's going up, like, we still have to be ready for what happens. Like Mother Jones said, educate yourself for the coming struggle.
Yep. And and this has gone on over and over again, so don't be daunted if you have to fight the same battle again. But also your examples include things like ballot initiatives, which are not organizing struggles, but are not unrelated to minimum wage or to, you were proposing at lunch, let's work on the issue of heat in the workplace, or whatever, right? So there are a variety of other tactics in this, and I think the book tells the story really well, but I want to underscore its gains, its limits, its steps forward, its steps back, and its work still to be done. So there's a very powerful message about that. Last, question on this though. How much does the future of the labor movement depend on the future of democracy in America?
Well, if, boy, it's interesting, right? I guess it depends on how democratic you think this country has been or is already. I think there's, yeah, it is, yeah, it's also been a way, right? And I don't think anyone's arguing that if the election goes one way this year, things are going to get way worse. Not that they're great under the other guy. This is the trouble with the two-party system, right? Like, that's a whole, if we could get rid of that whole thing tomorrow, I'd be on board. But that is, I am not the king of the world, so that's not happening yet. I think without even the semblance of democracy, the labor movement is in bad shape because even if our laws aren't what they need to be and our protections aren't as robust as they need to be, and the fines and penalties we have for union busters and bad employers and employers that abuse their workers, they're there. And it took a lot of people, a lot of work to get them there. You know, like, it used to be illegal to join a union. They had a whole war about it in Appalachia that they didn't even win. You know, the government used to bomb workers who were on strike and set the dogs on them and set the coal and iron police in Pennsylvania, which became the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania police on them. The safeguards we have right now aren't strong enough to help everyone in the way that they should be. But without them, we do not want to go back to that darker age. Like, a lot of people died during those years when there were no safeguards. There was nobody on our side. None of the politicians even felt like they had to pay lip service to workers or unions. A union endorsement was probably like a black mark. You know, we can't afford to go back to that. So we need to hold on to the scraps of democracy we have, ideally strengthen them, perhaps in a more direct way. It's funny. I mean, I'm literally an anarchist, so when it comes to electoral stuff, I'm not the right person to ask, but I would like to not descend into full fascism. So
let's make that a ringing call.
Given my druthers, I would prefer not to do that. So, yeah, labor and democracy, obviously, they go hand in hand. The freedom to exist, the freedom to live your life, to have a decent wage, to be safe at work, I feel like they should all almost even be closer. Like, the people that are screaming about, we need to save democracy, like, you should be paying attention to the labor movement. Funnel some of that nice PAC money our way. Like, go door knock for your local union elections. Go join the picket line. Like, it's more connected than I think some people outside of the labor cinematic universe realize.
Yeah, I think people sometimes think democracy is just like it's either on or off. Oh, we've got one. Okay.
Yeah, like, we like
right?
this guy.
But labor, we know there's a project. We know it's a struggle. We know you have to keep working on it. And maybe we need that consciousness for democracy too.
Yeah, you don't just clock in every couple of years or like, voting, it's fine. That's a whole thing. But there's so much more you can do. Like, something I tell people when we talk about how much despair there often is around the whole process is like, look, even if you can't change what people are doing in Washington, you can change what's happening on your block. Yeah. You can change what's happening in your workplace and in your neighborhood. Yeah. You can start building the world you want to see just by walking out your front door. And that's the work that's never going to end. It's not like circular. It's not going to depend on what rando calls you or texts you 1,000,000 times because you've got to email once. We're going to create the world that we want to live in. The people on top are generally none of my business because they don't represent me. I don't think they represent my view of the world or most people. Most people just want to be left alone. And the government insists on not doing that. So I would love to see the democracy defenders investing some of that energy and resources into labor while we're on a hot streak, you know?
So this is a good place to pause our conversation, but read the book, as I said before. And it's a book about people who did things that didn't always seem possible for people who want to do things now. So I recommend it highly.
Thank you. You're so nice.
So I want to take some questions, but I don't want to get us too far behind. So maybe we could take 2 questions and then call it. We got 2 questions. Okay, Adam, and let me just call on the other person. Janelle, sorry. Great.
You guys gonna fight for it?
Yeah, there it is. Hi. Janelle Austin from Minneapolis. I'm just going to read my question because I wrote it down. You briefly mentioned prison labor unions. Christian Rivera-Coba and Hardel Sherrill are 2 names lifted up in George Floyd Square whose families I personally know, who both died while incarcerated. Last year, dozens of our neighbors were incarcerated on RICO charges as they were in the 1990s, and that incarceration sweep created a silencing effect in the black community for fear that they could be incarcerated by association. There is also a lot of social movement organizing in Minneapolis around prison conditions by BLM and Be Their Voices, because so many of the people in prison are our community. So, in the black community in Minneapolis, there's a lot of intersectionality between the police lynching of black and brown bodies and those who escape death only to be incarcerated for forced labor. Can you speak more to what you know about the labor movements in prisons and what further union work is needed to continue forward progress to protect people often forgotten by those of us who are not incarcerated?
Yes, thank you for that. That's one of my favorite's a weird word. That's a topic that I enjoy speaking to labor audiences about because there is, I think, far too little recognition that incarcerated workers, people that are in prisons and forced to work, like they're part of the labor movement too. They are workers too. They are our siblings too. And it's an indictment on the movement that there's so little attention paid to the horrific conditions that they're trapped in. The latest piece I just worked on, reported out for In These Times, is about Alabama and the class action suit that 10 currently and formerly incarcerated individuals are levying against the state because of the forced labor, basically prison slavery system that the state is benefiting off of and actually using it to keep particularly skilled or like trustworthy black incarcerated workers inside the system and denying them parole. It's disgusting. It goes really deep. And I'm sure Alabama's not the only place that's happening. But there is a really robust history of incarcerated workers organizing in this country. I was really thrilled to write about it in the book because I knew there was something there, but I had not come across it in most of the other labor books I had been reading. But especially during the 70s, while obviously the Black Power movement and the Brown Power movement and a lot of other movements for liberation were sweeping the country, the prisoners' rights movement was a big part of that. And there's actually a whole wave of prisoners' labor unions. I mentioned the North Carolina Prisoners' Labor Union because they were a big one. They actually affiliated with the North Carolina AFL-CIO and ACLU. Like they had a very significant inside-outside relationship there. But there was a ton of organizing in California and in the Midwest and other states too. And they were at one point, where was it? I think it was Rhode Island. There was a point where incarcerated workers were essentially left to run the prison for a little while in Walpole. And observers from Harvard came in and remarked that they were doing such a better job than any of the guards or anything that it should just be left to them, which is, yeah. But so there's this big wave. Daniel Berger wrote a bunch of really good. He wrote a book specifically, Captive Nation, that gets into a lot of the organizing. All of his body of work is really illuminating around this subject specifically. But the 70s were a hot spot. And then that Supreme Court decision that I mentioned, the 1977 Jones versus North Carolina Prisoners' Labor Union decision, essentially that fucked it all up. Because the wardens at the prison where that union was most active, they didn't like that. They didn't want the incarcerated workers to organize. They didn't want any kind of solidarity between black and brown and white incarcerated workers. So they turned it into a legal matter. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that court case decided that incarcerated people don't have the right to unionize. They don't have the right to join an organization. They had that right stripped from them. And that had a really deeply chilling impact on incarcerated workers organizing around the country, because that just, that's a punch in the gut. And that obviously people continue to organize and resist in the ways they could, whether through hunger strikes or finding other ways to protest inside the walls. But there wasn't really another attempt at an organized movement until around 2014, when IWOC, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, which is part of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, they launched in, maybe Chicago, like in the Midwest. And they started organizing workers inside the walls. And it's an incarcerated worker-led group. I'm actually on their media committee if you want to learn more about them. But they're all over the place, and they've been involved with other groups like Jailhouse Lawyers Speak and the Free Alabama movement, who have been behind and who have orchestrated and led a lot of the big nationwide prison strikes we've seen in 2018 and 2019, 2021. I think there was a small one last year. There's rumblings of something happening right now in Alabama that might spread. Like, when I was writing the book, one of my best friends was incarcerated in Rikers. And he's in the book because while we were chatting, he was telling me about how he and the other folks in his dorm were organizing a strike to get soap and masks and everything, because they were, Rikers during the early days of COVID was just a slaughterhouse. So people are still resisting. They're still organizing. There are ways for folks on the outside to get involved and to tap in and support. And there are organizations that are always looking for support in that way. So incarcerated workers, they never gave up. They've just had an even more incredibly difficult round of obstacles thrown in their path. But that still hasn't stopped people from trying. So that was my favorite chapter in the book, because I wanted to really emphasize that this is part of labor's history and its past and its present and its future. Because if we're not paying attention to the most vulnerable and oppressed workers, then what are we good for?
Possible that you've just answered my question. But when I first joined the IWW, I got a hold of the history of the union. When I first joined the IWW, I got a hold of a history of the union, and it explained to me that there were some sectors of the labor movement that were more militant than others, like longshore labor or the engine stokers on ships or the logging industry. Can you think of, for structural reasons, particular sectors of the working class that are organically more militant now, that are more radical in their tendencies?
The question being if there are some industries and groups of workers that are kind of more inherently radical. I love the longshore workers because they've been radical since the jump, the ILWU. Maybe it's something about knowing your power, because if the dock workers decide they're shutting something down, then that's it. Maybe there's a reason the flight attendants are a very militant union. If they don't show up to work, that's it. The railroad workers, if they hadn't, all that unpleasantness hadn't occurred, if they had decided to strike, and I know a lot of them are ready to, that would have really shut things down. But also, I think you find that workers that are approaching their union work, their union membership, from a political place as well as like a place of solidarity or economic justice. Like, if people come into it thinking, oh, I'm going to be part of a union as part of my own radical politics, like if you're already a socialist or a communist or anarchist, one of the many radicals that have always been part of this movement that no one likes to talk about, you're going to have that analysis and you're going to bring it to the work that you do. I think it's not really a surprise that a lot of the unions we're seeing organized around calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, there are a lot of grad students and academic workers who are involved in those calls. And those are folks that read a lot and talk to a lot of different people and have time to develop politics. But also, the UAW is involved in that. And I'm sure not every UAW member is excited about the direction the union is going, but enough of them are that they're able to get work done. I think there's something to be said by understanding your place in kind of the vast machinery of making society work and realizing if I throw a monkey wrench in here, something big's going to happen. Like, if I had gone on strike when I was at Vice, that would have been an unpleasant week for my bosses. But if all the farm workers in California go on strike, no one's going to eat. And they have a very long history of organizing in a very militant fashion because they know how important they are. All work is essential, but some folks have a little bit more of an opportunity to cause chaos. And we tend to see those workers being the ones who are more interested in the idea of thinking about it or building toward it or at least talking about it.
So just quickly, I think we're going to take a very short 10-minute break before our next and final roundtable, Innovating a Labor Movement Resurgence, again here in the Carson Ballroom. Please join me in thanking Kim Kelly and Craig Calhoun for a wonderful lecture and conversation.